The hum of footsteps echoed through the pristine hallways as a young nurse, Grace Miller, adjusted her name badge. It was her first day at Meadowview General Hospital, a place known for its prestige, but also its silence about what truly happened behind closed doors. As Grace stepped into the crowded nurses' station, conversations quieted, eyes lingered a little too long, and smiles grew thin. Why? Because Grace was different. She was the only black nurse in the room. Before we dive into this gripping tale, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from today. And if you love stories of courage and change, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Grace tried to ignore the stares as she approached the head nurse, Sandra Hart, for her first assignment. Sandra handed over a patient chart without meeting her eyes. "Room 314. Try not to get lost," she said with a condescending smirk. As Grace turned to leave, another nurse, Emily Jones, brushed past her, muttering just loud enough to be heard, "I don't know why they're hiring people like her these days." Grace paused, the words slicing through her like ice. People like her. But instead of snapping back, Grace forced a small smile and moved forward. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to make a difference. That same day, a patient in room 314, a frail elderly man, needed immediate care. Grace quickly assessed the situation and prepared to administer medication, but Emily stepped in, arms crossed. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Emily sneered, loud enough for others to hear. A few nearby nurses exchanged glances, their smirks only making Grace's hands shake more. Grace took a deep breath. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied firmly, meeting Emily's gaze. Then, without waiting for a response, she completed the task flawlessly. Emily said nothing, but her narrowed eyes followed Grace out of the room. That evening, a new patient was rushed into the ER, a man in his 50s with an air of quiet authority. He introduced himself as David Carter, a businessman recovering from surgery complications. Grace was assigned to his care. Grace introduced herself and began checking his vitals. Just then, the door opened, and Dr. Phillips, a senior white doctor, walked in. He stopped mid-step, frowning when he saw Grace. "What are you doing here?" Dr. Phillips demanded sharply. "I'm Mr. Carter's assigned nurse," Grace replied, keeping her voice steady. Dr. Phillips turned toward David, ignoring Grace completely. "I'll get someone more qualified to help you," he said coldly. Before Grace could respond, David sat up straighter, his voice calm but firm. "Dr. Phillips, what makes you think she's not qualified?" "Look, Mr. Carter," Dr. Phillips began, clearly irritated. "I just think our patients deserve—" "Stop." David's tone was sharp this time. "I don't care what you think. She's here to do her job, and I trust her to do it. Maybe it's you who needs to reconsider your place here." Dr. Phillips stood silent, his face red with embarrassment. Without another word, he stormed out. Grace turned to David, stunned. "Thank you," she said softly. David smiled knowingly. "Don't thank me yet. I'm just here to rest, but who knows? I might be back sooner than you think." The next morning, Grace arrived at work to learn that David Carter had been discharged. She was relieved. He'd been the only kind face she'd seen so far, but rumors were already flying about what had happened with Dr. Phillips. Some nurses avoided Grace entirely, while others smirked as she walked by. Then that evening, David Carter returned. Only this time, he didn't arrive as a patient. He arrived in a sharp suit, holding a leather briefcase, his presence radiating quiet authority. Nurses whispered in shock, trying to figure out why he was back. Before the staff could piece it together, an emergency meeting was called in the hospital auditorium. Doctors, nurses, and administrators filled the seats, murmuring in confusion. The room fell silent when David Carter walked to the podium. "Good evening," he began, his voice echoing across the room. "I didn't introduce myself properly yesterday. My name is David Carter, and I am the new chair of Meadowview's hospital board." Gasps filled the room. Grace, sitting in the back, froze. David continued. "I came to this hospital as a patient, and what I witnessed shocked me. A nurse, dedicated, talented, and compassionate, was treated as though she didn't belong, not because of her skills, but because of her appearance. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Dr. Phillips, standing near the exit, shifted uncomfortably. His gaze fell to the floor as a dozen pairs of eyes bore into him, their silent judgment louder than any reprimand. The room's heavy silence clung to him like a shadow he couldn't escape. "This ends today," David said firmly. "Effective immediately, we will be implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training. Leadership will be held accountable, and staff will be evaluated on how they treat not just patients but each other." The room erupted into murmurs. Grace sat frozen in her seat, the weight of his words sinking in. Over the next few weeks, changes rippled through Meadowview General. Dr. Phillips was quietly removed from his position. Grace became a symbol of hope for other nurses who had stayed silent for too long. But here's the twist, one nobody saw coming. A month later, Grace received an envelope at her locker. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Grace, your quiet strength reminded me why I do this job. Hospitals should heal, not hurt. I hope you'll accept this opportunity. It's time for you to lead. David Carter." Underneath the note was an official letter. Grace Miller had been promoted to Head of Diversity and Inclusion. Grace read the letter, tears welling in her eyes. As she held the paper, memories of whispered insults, cold stares, and skeptical glances came rushing back. Yet here she was, standing tall, proof that quiet strength could shatter the loudest walls. For the first time, she felt seen, not as someone different, but as someone worthy. She let out a shaky breath, a small smile breaking across her face as she realized she had not only changed Meadowview General, she had become its quiet revolution. Before we close, let me ask you, what would you do if you were in Grace's shoes? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have kept going, like she did? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that inspire and challenge us, because sometimes the quietest voices leave the loudest impact.